Okay, in today's lecture you're going to make your first PHP page. First we'll learn the difference between static and dynamic pages, then you'll create your first PHP page and you'll learn some differences between PHP and Perl. You'll learn about PHP code islands, then we'll start talking about some variables and the different types of variables we can have as strings, numbers, and booleans. We'll learn about using the query string, I'll give some debugging tips, and then we'll finish up with some basic operations that we can do on the variables. Okay, first to demonstrate the difference between a static web page and a dynamic web page, I'm going to show you a couple of different sites. The first site that we'll go to is our college's or our department's homepage. Now every person that visits this site is going to see the same site. They're going to see the same links up here, they're going to see the same header, the same links down here. This right here is called a static page, and even though there are some moving elements in this page, it's still a static page. How it works is when I type in the address up here or click on a link to go to a page, I create a network connection to the web server, and then I request for this this page. The web server finds the HTML file that's been saved on its disk, and it sends that file over the network back to my browser, and then my browser displays it. Every person that visits this page is going to see the same page. Now dynamic pages, like this one right here, this is your course web page, work a little different. I can log in here, and it's going to generate a unique page for me. If you notice, my name is right here. To demonstrate this a little bit more, I'm going to click on my profile. Now this profile right here has my name in it and a little box of stuff about me. Now what I can do is I can edit this and maybe just say PHP right here, and now that has changed my web page right there. Now most of you are probably used to dynamic pages, like when you register for classes, when you log on to check your bank account balance, Facebook, and other things. Each web page that you view after you log in is customized for you. So how this works is when I type in the address in my browser, I make a network connection with the web server, and this time I request a file. Now the web server looks at the file and realizes that that isn't a web page, but is a program. So the web server runs the program, and the program generates a web page as it runs. Now it doesn't save that web page anywhere, it just generates the web page, and the web server sends that web page back to the browser. Now as it generated this web page, it realized that I was logged in, so it put my name here. It also was looking at my profile, and it gathered all of this information right here out of the database to display it. So that's the dynamic web page. Most websites that you visit are now dynamic websites, and in fact, at the beginning I lied to you. This too is also a dynamic website. It's run by Drupal. Drupal is a PHP program that allows you to set up a template so that you can have a common header and some common navigational links like up at the top and on the sides, and then you can create new web pages with its own content right in here. So if we click on another link, notice everything's up the top is the same, but the content is different. All of this content is coming out of a database. So most dynamic websites are database driven. All the templates and the HTML are all generated by a program, and the program pulls information out of the database, kind of fills in the blanks of the form, or fills in the blanks, and generates a web page that's unique and custom for each time you visit it. So that's the difference between a static and a dynamic web page. In this class we're going to learn how to create dynamic web pages, and by the end of it you should be able to create a program a lot like Drupal, where you can edit the content in the middle of pages, or let users log in and edit the content, and also you will be able to create a website, much like this website that you're using to get your homework assignments. Okay, now we're going to create our first dynamic web page using PHP. A lot of you probably already created some dynamic web pages using Perl in your 101 class. So I'm going to show you do the same thing that you did in Perl, but now this is going to be in PHP. You probably started off by printing out some HTML tags like this. Now, I'm going to save this file. I'm going to save it as first.php, and I saved it on the web server, and now I'm going to point my browser to it. And now you can see that I've created this web page. And now if we look at the web page, the source code right here, we see that it's my tags that have all been printed out by my PHP page. So what happened is I pointed my browser to it and made a network connection to the web server. The web server ran this program, and this program printed out a bunch of HTML tags and this header here in between the header tags right there. And when it printed that stuff out, it sent all of the stuff that it printed out over to my web page or over to my browser, and my browser then displayed it. So, and this is the Perl way, and with Perl, when you did it, it was really tedious because you had to do all of your tags you had to print out with quotes around it. We used these new lines right here at the end of the string to actually make the source code look good. I could take the new lines out, and if I were to do that when I viewed this source over here, then it would just be all on one line and it wouldn't be easy to read. So that's why I put the new lines in there. Well, PHP improves upon this Perl philosophy, or this Perl where you have to print out the tags, and they say instead, just go ahead and start putting your tags in your file. So if you've taken from your IT 240 class where you learned HTML, you typed up all of these all of your HTML tags, and you typed up your web page just like we're doing right here. Okay, so now we'll save that as a PHP page, and we'll refresh it, and now you can see that this is what the page looks like, and then when we view the source of it, it's just exactly what we typed into the file. So from this point, it doesn't look any different than what you've been doing, or how you've been creating web pages in your HTML class that you took. So the power comes with what we call PHP code islands. So what we can do now is we can enter into PHP mode within our web page. So this is called HTML mode, and this is where we put all of our HTML tags. And then once we enter into our PHP mode, we can start printing out Now notice I can still print out tags, or I can put my tags outside of it. Right there. And when we refresh this and look at the page again, if you notice that it still looks like an HTML page, but if you notice the difference between the source from the browser and the page that we actually typed up is that the PHP code block is now gone, the print is now gone, but it did print out this right here that showed up in our source over here that displayed, and it displayed it right here. So these right here are called PHP code islands. So how you normally develop a PHP page is you develop your HTML, and then when you want to customize a little part of your HTML, you enter into a PHP code island or a PHP code block, and then you print something out. Now this also is taught you your first PHP command, which is print. And print just takes something and prints it out into the HTML. Now, something that I use a lot more frequently than print is actually echo. It's just a habit of mine, so just so you notice that print and echo do the exact same thing. Okay, now a lot of you might be wondering why I decided to put this in here. Wouldn't it just be easier to just put it in the HTML right here? And it would be a lot easier to put in the HTML right here, but when I put it in here, I can customize what I print out. I can make decisions, I can pull something out of the database and put it right here instead, and I can, by pulling something out of the database, I can make a decision and find out that it's a certain type of element, and I could do one thing instead of another thing. So we can really customize what we print out inside of this PHP code block. But once we're in our HTML code area, or the HTML, we can't change anything. We're always going to have this HTML. Whereas this can change based off of who's visiting the web page and what information might be in the database, or what time of day it is, or something like that. So, to learn how to start customizing content in here, the first thing that we're going to learn about are variables. And variables hold values. Now there's several types of variables, but to start a variable in PHP, you do a $sign and then a name. And this could be any name that you want. There might be some limitations. You might not be able to start it with a number. You have to start it with a letter, but after you start it with a letter, you can start adding numbers on the end. But any name that you want to use, you can use for this variable name. And then a variable name also has content, something that's attached to it, or a value. So you can think of this as a name and then a value. So you could think of, since every person has a name, you could think of this being the name of the person, and then this being their actual person, or the actual person they are. Or this could be maybe an address to a house. This would be the actual house. So that's a variable. They store values, and right now this is storing a string value, and now we can, I'll just add a paragraph tag around this, and now I can print out that variable, and when we see it, nothing has really changed. When we look at the source, we see that it's been put in there. But now if we look at the code, we'll notice that the PHP has been stripped out, this full line has been stripped out, there's no echo, and all we get is the content. So, to review, this is a variable, this is its value, and when we echo a variable out, we actually take whatever value's in there and we print that out. We don't actually print out the name of the variable, we print out the content. Another way that we can do this is we can put strings around it. We could put our get that right there. We'll take off the paragraph tags out here. And now when we put a variable, something that starts with a $, inside of a string right here, this variable is going to get replaced by whatever its value is. So we'll look at this. Again, nothing has changed. All different ways of putting content, this string right here on the page. So you can include it right in the middle of the string, which means that if we actually want a $, say this is how much something costs. Now if I change that, when I look now it says $5.50, but now let's say that I want to put a $, right here so that I could see how much it is. And I can, in order for it to show up in the string, if I just do that, it does show up, but what I need to do is I need to escape it, saying no, I really want a $, there. This isn't going to be a variable to replace. So when we do that, now we see the $'s up there. Okay. Now variables can hold different types of data. This variable right here is holding a string, and that's why I called it my string. And a string is just letters and numbers, and letters, numbers, characters, all stringed together. It could be a sentence. So now we see this is a sentence. And strings are all made up of text. Now notice before I had a string that had numbers in it, but it's still a string, even though this, you look at this and it's a number, but because it has the quote marks around it, it's still a string. The other variables can be numbers. And when we do numbers, we don't have to put quote marks around it at all. So we'll print this number out, surrounded by paragraph tags. And this 550 happens to be a string because I have quotes around it. This happens to be a number. And other values that we can have are called booleans. And a boolean is just a true or false value. So we can either put true there or false. So variables can hold strings, numbers, or variables. Now, what happens if I go ahead and print something out that I haven't defined before? And what I mean by defined, notice I said my string equals this, or my number equals that. Well, there's no something equals line in my code. So what happens when I print that out? And just to even look at the page source, we don't get anything out here. Okay? So if we haven't seen a variable before, then, and we go to print it out, then then it happens to be nothing. And what I mean by nothing, if the variable is going to be used in the way of a string, we're going to get a string with no characters in it. If the variable is going to be used as a number, we're going to get the number 0. And if the variable is going to be used as something as true or false, a boolean, we're going to get false. So if we haven't ever set a variable to something, then it'll be nothing. Now what I mean by set is we have to set something equal to it. Another thing to note with variables is the only time they change is when they're on the right hand side of an equal sign. So my string changes here, but it will not change here. My number changes here, but it will not change here. Something doesn't change at all because it's not on the right hand side of an equal sign. And some of you might have come from Java. You've been used to declaring what type of variable you're going to have. So in Java, you'd actually say this is going to be a string by putting string in front of it. Or, and then you'd say this would be an integer, which is a type of number, and or maybe a double, which is a floating point number. None of that exists in PHP. You just come up with the name of a variable and set it to what you want it to be equal. And I'll show you one more thing before we quit for this lecture. And this right here, Php Info, this here will print out a whole bunch of information on your web page. So we'll go ahead and see what that looks like after we save it. Once the Php Info, this prints out a whole bunch of stuff, and this can help us debug. Most of this stuff you won't ever know what it really means, but they're just settings within the web server and the PHP engine. But if you ever want to test to make sure your PHP page is working, then you just print out Php Info, and then we can see all of these values. And then this is also something, if you get into more advanced and you find that something isn't working, you might be able to check on some settings within your PHP or your servers so you can get things to work. However, there are some things that we will use. Okay, now there's still a few more things that we need to talk about before we finish this screencast for today. And the first thing is comments. And comments in Whitespace. Comments in Whitespace are things that are ignored when we run our PHP, when the PHP script runs. So when I put this PHP info function in here, we saw that all of this showed up in our web page. Now, if we don't want that to happen, we could just delete PHP info out of this completely, or we can comment it. One way to comment is just to do 2 forward slashes, and the way to learn the difference between a forward slash and a backslash is a forward slash looks like it's falling. If it were to fall over, it'd fall on its face, and a backslash would fall on its back. So 2 forward slashes is a comment in PHP, and that means that this thing here will get ignored. And so now when we refresh this page, we see that the stuff that was included in for PHP info is no longer there. We can comment out multiple lines. When we do 2 forward slashes, it ignores the rest of this line. So we can put up a whole bunch of stuff here, and it still doesn't show up. Okay. Now if we want to comment out multiple lines of code, you do a forward slash and then an asterisk, and you get the asterisk by pressing Shift 8. And then you end it by an asterisk and another forward slash. When you do that, all of that's ignored, and so now you can see that none of this stuff in the PHP code block shows up. So that's a multi-line comment. We'll leave this in here. So what can we use comments for? Well, I showed you one use is we can put some code in, and then if we don't want to delete it out because we might want it in the future if we're trying to test or something like that, we could just kind of comment it out, and then it stays there in our code, and if we ever want it back, we can put it back in. Another thing that comments are used for, or useful for, is to explain what we're going to do, or explain our code so that when we read it, we understand what we did. So I might put a comment here saying, I am showing some variables. And you can use multi-line comments to make a paragraph worth of notes. That way you can understand what the code is doing. Another thing to note is whitespace. If you notice, I could put whitespace is anything that isn't seen, or that you don't see something show up. So all of this stuff, ironically on this screencast, is all black, but anything that doesn't show up is whitespace. Now some of you might think that this might cause an error because all of these things are really spaced out. I put a couple of enters in there. So, but if I refresh the page, you can see that there wasn't an error that showed up at all. Now, I can get rid of all this white space and put it back. And notice it doesn't affect this at all. Another thing to note is the new lines in here. I'll just replace this with content. This is a string. Now, if I want, on this web browser, if I want the content goes here, notice this is one line. Let's say that I want the goes here to show up down below this content. Some people might think that we could put a new line character, and this is a \n, and that stands for a new line. And when we do that, some people think that over in the browser that we'll see that this will go down here, but as you can tell, that didn't happen. When we look here, we see that actually in the source code it did happen. So we have content, and then this shows up on a new line. So when you look at the source, the new lines really do show up. The problem is when the browser renders it or displays everything, it ignores those new lines, and the only time you actually get a new line would be if you put this tag right there. So the only reason why you would use this would be is if you care about how your source looks. But if you actually want a new line to show up, you can do that. And we don't need this right here for the new line to show up either. Now we can see that this is all on one line here, but the browser actually separates it out into two lines because we do put this new line tag in right there. So what you should learn that white space doesn't matter at all. We can put as many spaces, enters in this as much as we want, and it doesn't really matter. One thing that you should do though is try to keep things as small as possible. You want to see as much code as possible on your screen. Now that you want to make it readable, but you also want to condense it as much as possible. So it wouldn't be smart to be putting a lot of space in between all of these commands, because that reduces the amount of code that you can see. So by using white space wisely, we can condense our code and see more. Now we actually might leave a blank space here if we're going to logically separate segments of our code. This is all about printing stuff out. This was something that I commented out. Okay. Now one thing here is, so far this isn't customizable at all. I mean, when you hit this page, everybody's still going to see the same thing because our PHP code is always printing out the same thing. Well, I'm going to show you one thing that you can do to customize, just so that you can see where this might be going, and that's through the use of the query string. So what is the query string? If we look up in this address bar, we can see that this is the name of the server, and this server is running on my machine. That's why it's called the local host. The local host refers to the computer you're at. And then this is the directory, and then the PHP page that I'm doing. Well, I can put a question mark after that, and then I can start doing some name value pairs. Just like variables that I've shown you right here are names and values. Up here there are names and values as well. So I could put my name is Chris up here. Now if you notice, nothing happens right here, but we still get our PHP page. We still see it, but I have this question mark, name equals Chris. So now if I want to actually see that, I can do this. Like that. I'll teach you some other stuff that we can do with strings. Now, I don't have to do this, I'm just doing it to demonstrate, but I can put a period in between elements when I go to print stuff out. And what this really means is to concatenate strings, or to put them together. So I'm taking this string right here, and then this string right here, and I'm putting them all together. Now, it's just this string, the periods say, take this string and add this to it, and add this to it, so it makes one string with all three of these strings put together. We can also include this right here. So this is saying take this string and put them together. Now this is going to get replaced with whatever this is. These are just some stuff that I wanted to show you so that you knew. I often make use of these periods right here to concatenate strings together. But now back to this, notice right here we have name. And that's the same thing that comes in the first half of this name value pair. So here's the name, here's the value. And it's called name. Now I could call this something like foo as well, and then I would have to put foo right here. Okay, and now let's see what happens when we do that. And now it says Chris. Well, someone else might put their name up here, like Jerry, and now it says Jerry. And notice we have this foo. Now notice the foo here and the foo here are the same. And if I were to say put something else here like name or something like that, then nothing shows up. If we view our page source though, we get the paragraph tags, but there's nothing in between them. That means this variable was blank. That means this was blank because there was no variable named foo. And so there's one thing that we can do to customize it. Now let's say that we want more of these. Let's say that we want to bring in a name, maybe a date as well. Okay. Again, to do this, we do $_get. It all has to be capital case right here. And now we can put the date on here. Now, I didn't do anything to print it out. Maybe I'll put this up here. And maybe we'll put a message. Hello, today is. And we'll refresh this. Now it's hello, today is, except for I don't have the foo. It's now name. Hello Jerry, today is today. And notice there's an ampersand in between these two. So it's name equals value and name equals value. So the ampersand separates the name value pairs, and each name value pair has an equal sign in between it. So we'll go ahead and say maybe today is April 19th. And now we have, hello Jerry, today is April 19th. This shows up right here when we look at our code. The date right here gets filled in right there. And so there's some customizations that you can do with your web page based off of what people would type into your URL. And this right here is called the query string. So that's called the query string. Okay, one more thing to note is sometimes you might make mistakes. Now during these screencasts, I'll probably make a lot of mistakes, and I'll go ahead and show you what happens when I do make the mistakes, and I'll also try to show you what kind of thought process I go through to try to fix them. So it's good that I make mistakes because you'll probably make mistakes, maybe not as many as me, but you'll probably make mistakes, and you'll want to know how to fix them. So one mistake that you might do is I might forget these semicolons. I forget semicolons all the time, so when I do that and I refresh the page, we get this parse error, and it tells us on line 12. Now if we look on line 12, we might be just looking and thinking the error has to be on this line 12 right here. But sometimes it's the error before. Because I forgot the semicolon right there, it couldn't understand line 12 because it was expecting a semicolon before it expected another echo command. So even though it said line 12, the error was really on line 11, so the line numbers are approximately show you where they are. But usually a syntax error means that you forgot something or you mistyped something, you don't have the right format, and you fix it and it works again. So when you see those things, don't just check the line number that it says, check above it and see if you forgot a semicolon or anything else. Another error that you might run into is, this is more of a runtime error. Everything seems to work. You see your page, but it's not doing what you want it to do. And that might happen for a number of reasons, but here's an example. I use all lowercase letters for this right here, but let's say I go right here and I accidentally use a capital case letter. Now in PHP, case matters. When you learn HTML, it doesn't matter, but in PHP, case matters. So let's say that I do this. I'm expecting the number 5 to go out. I refresh, and now there's no number 5. And I can view my source. I can see that the paragraph tags are there for the number 5, but I can't see the number 5 anywhere. And that could be a very confusing error. So one thing that when that happens is you really have to look at this name and say, did I type that exactly right? Is that the exact same thing as this, including the case? And if I look at these, I could say, oh, I got a capital N. Now other things might happen. You might miss a letter, you might misspell it or use a capital letter or something like that, but if they're not exactly the same, they will not match up and this number will not get printed out. Now another thing that we can do with numbers as we do this is we can do some math. So we could go my number 2 equals 5, or maybe $, my number plus 10. And then down here we'll print out my number 2 instead. And notice we get 15 out here. And the important part about this is not on the right hand side of an equal sign, so it doesn't get changed. The only thing that gets changed is the thing on the right hand side of the equal sign. Over here we have all of our math operations. It's just the same that you should have learned in Perl, so we have plus, minus, multiply, and divide. And so there's a little bit of math. that you can do with these numbers, and I also showed you how you can concatenate strings with the periods. So those are some operations you can do on these variables. And again, it's important to note, unless you're on the right hand side of the equal sign, you will not change. So there's no way that this number can change unless it's over here. Now one thing that we can do is we can have the same thing on the right and the left side. So that means 5 plus 10, and then we replace the 5 with a 10. That means the 5 is gone, and now we get 15. So that looks the same. And this is fairly common. We just want to add 10 to a number, or add 1 to a number, or something like that. So there's also this plus equals. And that's this exact same thing as I just did. It's this number plus this over here, and then we do the assignment. So that's kind of on the right hand side of this equal sign over here, so this number will change. And we can also do this with strings. Right here we have my string is content. We can do period equals, so now this means take this string right here, which is stored in my string, so take whatever's in my string and concatenate on the end of it this string right here. So now we'll look at that, and now we see that it's one string right there. So you can do that with both numbers. There's also a minus equals and a multiply equals. And another thing that you can do with the numbers is you can add 1 or subtract 1. These are all shortcuts. You can express these in many ways, but add 2 pluses behind it, that adds 1 to the number, subtracts 1 from the number. So now we get 5 plus 10 minus 1, and we should get 14 out. And we got the 14. Okay. So what we've learned today is we learned the difference between static and dynamic pages. We also learned about comments and whitespace. We learned about the PHP Info. We learned about variables and strings, and we learned about concatenation, some math operations, and we also learned about the query string, where we can customize our page based off of what is typed in